Hello everyone, we are in our last week for health psychology, and this week we're going to be covering two modules. We have module 12 and module 13, and that wraps up our last week. So let's start with module 12. We'll be covering chapter 13, which is all about chronic illness. I have the objectives here for you. They're a little bit different than previous chapters that I've listed objectives for, mainly because there's just a lot of components in this chapter. There's a lot of conditions covered when we talk about chronic illness, and so I just kind of wanted to set it up a little differently in a way that might make a little more sense and be easier to follow along with. So when we're talking about chronic illness, we're first going to just, I'd say the first third of the book is dedicated to just explaining what is chronic illness exactly. Some basics, some stats, some prevalence rates, and things like that, but then spends a good amount of time talking about adjusting to a chronic illness. So how do people get used to life with chronic illness? What are their reactions to it? How do they cope? So coping is a big part of this chapter, and we've talked about it in previous chapters when we've talked about coping with stress, and it's very similar. You're going to see a lot of some of the same concepts that we talked about before, but here we're not dealing with coping with stress. We're coping with something that can be all-encompassing. I mean, not that stress isn't, but chronic illness is one of those things that it's very scary. You could not know what's going on from day to day. You could be fine for a little while and then not. You can be out of work and then back at work. And so it really takes a toll on all elements of a person's life. Their interpersonal relationships with one another, responsibilities, life goals, dreams, all of that. So really it's understanding sort of how a person goes about coping with all of that. And more importantly too, how do they cope during a health crisis? When their disease is at its worst, or they're not adhering well to their medical regimen. What would the person be doing? What would their normal response sort of be? And what has been found to be helpful in terms of coping. So we'll take a look at all of those sort of in a general sense, and then the second third of the book then really starts to break down some really big categories of chronic illness. So we're going to take a look at asthma, epilepsy, nervous system injuries, diabetes, and arthritis. Those are the kind of 5 key big ones. And I've outlined for you under asthma sort of the elements that we're going to cover. And these are the same elements that you should know for each one of these. So, what is asthma? What's the physiology of it in the body? What's happening in your body physiologically when you have asthma? What causes it? And what are the effects of it on a person's life? What might be the medical regimen for asthma? And then psychosocial factors involved in asthmatics. So I want you really... I'm going to take out this A part. I see that this really doesn't need to be here. This is a detail that you're going to find when you read in the book. But, if we look at items 1, 2, 3, and 4, you should be answering those same questions for each one of these disease states. Okay, what's the medical regimen like? What psychosocial factors play a role? What's the physiology like? And overall, what is the condition like? What are the prevalence rates? Who does it hit most? Is there a certain demographic that it takes its toll on more so than others? Those would be the key kind of component things to understand within each of these disease conditions. So this would be a good spot to really make some good note cards And, rather than getting caught up in a lot of the nitty-gritty details, really try to understand an overview of each disease, of how it's affecting the body, the mind, the person socially, their obligations and their social roles that they play. And I think that that's going to really help out a lot. And some of these conditions we've touched on in asthma. We talked about it when we looked at tobacco use and how it can be affected. Asthma can be a result of smoking and use of tobacco. So we have talked a little bit about it, and like diabetes, we talked about. There's a section on it when we talked about eating and diet and weight control, because diabetes is, at least type 2 diabetes, is very linked to diet. It's important to discuss at that time. So some of these we have covered a little bit already. So hopefully that will help provide a base. But if you need to go back to some of those previous chapters to really get a gauge and remember, what did we cover, what did we talk about, that would surely be helpful to do that. Then the last third of the book talks about the intervention part. So, when you have a chronic condition, what kind of help exists, what interventions have been shown to be helpful for people battling a chronic illness. Some interventions are specific to the illness, but some are not. Some are very across the board, able to be used no matter the chronic condition. So we'll be looking at things that influence one's adjustment to chronic illness. We'll be looking at resources that are geared at educating people about chronic illness, providing social support. We've talked already about social support. And then what might be some behavioral measures that we might see used. We'll talk a little bit about relaxation and biofeedback. And we've sort of looked at this a little bit when we talked about the pain chapter. We looked at some different types of therapy that are used to control pain that involve relaxation and biofeedback. So definitely something you've heard about already and very relevant here with chronic conditions. So aside from the behavioral, we also want to talk about some cognitive methods. And these are really a person's attempts at coping. We talk about cognitive control. Where do your thoughts go? And how do your thoughts influence your behavior, your patterns, your regimen, whether you're taking medication or you're having to do something behaviorally to control your disease, and what might those look like. So cognitive methods really are used a lot, very integrative. And then we'll look at some different types of therapy, interpersonal and family therapy, that can be super helpful for those who are undergoing chronic illness, because really when one person in the family is chronically ill, it affects everybody. It takes a toll on everyone, and really getting all family members on the same page is key to successful treatment. And then we'll take a look at the all-encompassing collaborative or integrative care approaches, which are really where it's at. Any mainstream care approaches to chronic conditions are really going to aim to target all of these things. So they might include a little bit of everything, and they also include a little bit of everyone. So you'll see many different team members that might be on a care team for a person with chronic illness. You might have psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, PAs, occupational therapists, physical therapists, specialists, oncologists, that sort of thing. So all of those people play vital roles in appropriate care approach, And that really needs to be integrative, and people need to be working together on behalf of the patient as well as the patient themselves. So those pretty much covers what the chapter is about. We've got some lecture slides here. They're shorter. Again, the lecture slides are meant to give you key big picture concepts. They're not meant to get into the nitty-gritty, because you can really read that on your own in the textbook, but they're just there to sort of help guide you. This module, we have a video assignment. You're going to be taking a look at cancer support groups. And cancer is a chronic illness. We've already talked a little bit about it in previous chapters, or touched on it at least. I'm going to be looking at support groups here. Not necessarily the fact that they're support groups for cancer is not necessarily the important key, but it's just, how are these support groups run? What do they do for the people in them? How are people using such groups? And you're going to get a good glimpse of, I think, a great example of what the interpersonal and family therapy aims to do. This is a type of that. Dr. David Spiegel is the one who runs these groups. He's still doing this today, even though the video you're going to see is a little bit older. He's still fully running these types of groups now, not just with cancer, but with other chronic illness groups, and very, very successful. It'll blow you away looking at the research of those who go through these kinds of groups while having cancer versus those who do not, and those who just go through basic cancer treatment and treating the physical illness. But those who go through the support groups, they get so much more. So you're going to be watching the video and completing the video questions as usual. And then your module discussion this week is also in Chapter 13 of Friedman and Martin, The Longevity Project. And it's looking at how masculine or feminine you are. And these are really not talking about social constructs necessarily of masculinity and femininity, but more like traits. We tend to associate certain traits with being masculine and certain traits with being feminine. And you can be masculine and carry some feminine traits. You can be feminine and carry some masculine traits. So try to think of it that way: personality traits, personality characteristics, rather than what does a girl do and what does a boy do, because we all know that is very in question, and it's up to the individual. But think too about the time that this study was done. This term and data was collected. You want to look at how did they, the researchers at the time, define masculinity and femininity, and why is that important to distinguish from, say, homosexual or heterosexual labels, because it's really very different concepts that we're talking about. So I want to make sure everyone's understanding masculinity and femininity. I want you to describe the relationship between feminine traits and long life. As you're going to see when you read, it's the feminine traits that have been shown to go the long haul. So ladies, yay, guys, I'm just kidding. Feminine traits can be very beneficial. So you'll want to be taking a look at, well, what are those exactly? Which ones? How did they predict long life, and what did we see happen in the termites that had those feminine traits? What were the links to social ties and gender? So males versus females, how were they with keeping up with their social ties? And what did this do for them? And then specifically, an interesting part of this chapter looks at what happens to men's health after they suffer a loss. So it gives you some clues there. And all in all, just, answering this last question, it has to do with feminine characteristics. So I hope that makes sense. That wraps up Module 12, and then we'll have one last module to complete this week.